You know, I'm going to give you a history lesson.
We got some dumbass motherfuckers floating around this country.
Stop laughing! And when I do, start.
Also, y'all did some nasty-ass jokes on my ass, too.
Funny jokes and unfunny jokes come out of the same birth.
You f***ing guys are unbelievable.
Why are you laughing?
Evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Why Are You Laughing, a history of comedy podcast. And today, I am pleased to introduce to you Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update, a staple of one of the longest-running shows in television history. Saturday Night Live, of course, going on its 50th season next year. They're celebrating their 50th anniversary, and Weekend Update is the longest-running bit, or whatever you want to call it, on that show. There's only one episode in 1984 that some form of Weekend Update hasn't appeared. Now, Weekend Update has gone through some changes, which we'll talk about as well. But we'll talk about all the different variations of Weekend Update and why it's been such a staple on that program. So we will be getting into that today. And a couple notes on previous episodes. One thing that came up last week in the Chris Rock episode, everyone called me a moron, basically. I guess Marion Barry was a massive news story, and just everyone talked about it at the time. So it wasn't as... The point I was trying to make was that to open a special with a story about the mayor of D.C. seemed ballsy to me, but I guess it was a much bigger thing, probably not unlike Rob Ford when that was a huge story, where like you couldn't go anywhere without people talking about it, I guess. So shame on me for not knowing that. I was 5 at the time. What do you want from me? You know?
Grow up faster.
I'm sorry, I can't. But I think at the core it was a good point I was making. All right. So go check out the Chris Rock episode, and keep suggesting specials. A couple people gave me some good Carlin suggestions. Some suggested Sam Kinnison's first special. One I wanted to do that came up is I thought about doing Mulaney's album because I'm a big fan of Mulaney's specials as well. But he put an album, I think, while he was still writing for Saturday Night Live, and we'll talk about Mulaney a little bit later in the show too. But Mulaney put out an album that I think is great and pretty underrated, so that might be on our list as well. But keep suggesting specials that we should do in the future because people seem to enjoy those. And you know the best place you can reach out to me. You can find all my links at blindmike.net. That's the easiest way to find everything we're doing. Blind Mike Project, Who Are These Socials, and Why Are You Laughing? All of our links are at blindmike.net. And if you want to become a member on Patreon or YouTube, then you can do that as well. Early access and bonus content available for members. And you support the show. That's how we keep the lights on here. So support the show by becoming a member or just spread the word. Like, comment, share. All that helps get more eyes on the show. It helps us find more people if you like and comment and do whatever else to boost us in the algorithm. So go to blindmike.net for all of those links, please. And check out our other shows. Like I said, Blind Mike Project and Who Are These Socials? Check those out. So, of course, SNL Weekend Update, massive staple. And when you think about what SNL was, it's funny that Weekend Update is very influential because now, like, you look at The Daily Show and what the Colbert Report was for a while, and now it seems like every podcast is kind of this. Like, the idea of merging comedy and news together seems very familiar to, like, this generation, but at the time it was pretty unique and weird, and that was really the whole idea of SNL at the beginning in general, was kind of like a hipstery niche thing, which you don't think of now because it's such an institution. And now it's like, you know, really the only reason to watch SNL is to applaud when Matt Damon walks on or something. It's just a cavalcade of celebrities. But at the time, it was really unique and weird. And you hear guys like Al Franken talk about how basically they couldn't find a home writing for television until SNL came along. So that's where we start in 1975. When writers start submitting packets to Lorne Michaels, who's got this idea for an NBC late-night comedy show. And this is him talking about one of the ideas he submitted for Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, on open mic night we did. I remember we did our World War III newscast, which was tragedy, death, catastrophe. Highlight tonight's news after this message.
Yeah.
Well, the stock market closed today for good, and now with the weather. Barney, new house. Barney, well, temperature's up to 10,000 degrees. Cooling off tomorrow to a low of 3,000. Don't get at those umbrellas yet. It was... and
it killed.
It killed. And it was a local news show. And that was actually part of the package that we submitted to SNL later in, I guess, in 75.
So once...
It's actually interesting to hear Franken talk about that because I've watched a couple different interviews where he's mentioning it. And he said him and Tom Davis, I think a guy that he went to high school with, and his writing partner, they submitted a packet to Lorne where it was the news parody, a movie spoof, a fake commercial, and I think there was one other thing. I'm forgetting what it is now. But it was basically the 4 tent poles of what Saturday Night Live is now.
Right.
Where, I wonder, did Lorne Michaels have this idea for this very structured thing of what SNL is now? Because now you don't have that weird, let's just do whatever. It's actually very formulaic. It's kind of got all the parts in place. Whereas at the beginning, I think the first episode of SNL ever, Carlin did 2 monologues, which is bizarre to think of now. They brought him back to do basically stand up again, which is pretty weird now when you think of what SNL is. Now it's very, cold open, intros, monologue, some commercial, a couple sketches, musical guest, weekend update, couple more sketches, musical guest, we're done,
I think I'd rather 2 monologues than 2 musical performances.
Well, what's interesting is we could do a whole SNL episode about stuff more in depth like this, but the idea of music, and I was just thinking about this with the Tonight Show as well, the idea that these late night shows still have a musical guest. It was cool back in the day because if you didn't happen to hear that song on the radio, you'd be like, holy shit, did you see what the Rolling Stones did on Carson last night? Whatever. I don't know if the Stones ever did Carson, but you know what I mean. You wouldn't see these certain songs or certain guests if it wasn't for these shows. You genuinely might not come across them. That doesn't exist with the internet anymore. So now it doesn't really make any sense to have a musical guest on when you think about it. But they just kind of do it because it's tradition. And that's what SNL is now. But I guess that goes back to my original point where at the beginning they were kind of just throwing shit against the wall and seeing what stuck. And Weekend Update is one of those things that stuck. And it wasn't always that way, though, which we'll get into in a minute. But obviously, Chevy Chase... probably the most famous Weekend Update guy ever. I don't think he's the best. A lot of people say he's the best, and I think that we believe that just because he's the first. Obviously, I lean towards Norm, but I think if you just look at what Dennis Miller did, or I even think Tina Fey and Jost and Che, there's a bigger body of work there to judge them on. Chevy was there for 1 season and became a massive star. And it was interesting to hear Lorne talk about it where, a lot of the cast ended up being very bitter toward Chevy because it was essentially like Chevy Chase and Friends on Saturday night. That's how big he got in that first season. That he was the guy. And he played the president and he did Weekend Update. But Lorne said one of the big things, and particularly in 1975, this really mattered. He was the one guy in the cast that every week got to say, I'm Chevy Chase. He would say, I'm Chevy Chase and you're not, was his catchphrase. But every week he would say his name. Whereas, John Belushi's in a karate outfit whacking pool tables or whatever he's doing, So that was a big advantage. You felt like you got to know the guy. And I think it's why Chevy was so linked to we could do the Tonight Show. We now know he was a terrible talk show host. But you just got the feel because he could sit behind a desk and he could talk to, the fake guests that would slide in on Weekend Update with him. You're like, oh, he could be, you got the feel that he could sit down and just have a conversation. And you kind of felt like you knew him. It's similar to what podcasts are now, but there was nothing like that in 1975. That's the closest you could feel to knowing a comedian like that, if that makes sense. And that's how Chevy like built a relationship with the audience and why he got so famous. And one thing that was also interesting, I listened to a couple Chevy Chase podcasts as well. I listened to him on Fly on the Wall and Marin and a couple of others. And he didn't talk a ton about specifically Weekend Update, so I don't have a lot of clips of him. But one thing he did say that I found interesting, and we probably touched on this a little in the Chevy Chase episode that we did. I know that we touched on it, but I probably brushed it off as bullshit at the time. And now having heard him talk about it more, I don't think that's the case. Because, so he left after one season. And he said at the time that it was because of a girl. He moved to Los Angeles to be with this girl he was with. That relationship ended up lasting like 9 more months. And then, he was off SNL and out of the relationship and then became this massive movie star. So I can always just thought that was a bullshit excuse. Like, he wanted to leave SNL. He got too big for it, whatever. He talked about it in a couple different interviews after we did that episode. He goes, no, what I wish, he goes, I really left for a woman, which is an idiotic decision now that I'm 80 years old, but at the time it seemed like the right thing to do. I made a promise to this woman that I'd move back to Los Angeles. It seemed like what I was supposed to do. But he's like, everything being equal, I'd like to be on that show like everyone else did. I like to have done 5 years on SNL and then move on to other things. And he says he didn't get movies right away. Like, Vacation was a couple years later, I think. So it is true that like there was a lull in Chevy's career, which is interesting to think. Like, I kind of just looked at it and said like, oh, bullshit, he moved across country for some girl. But no, sure enough, that's what happened. That's why he was only on SNL 1 year. It's pretty crazy.
Next we have Jane and Dan.
Yeah, so Chevy leaves after one season and is, like I said, massive star. He has the catchphrases and everything. People are looking forward to the news, Weekend Update. Like it's now a staple segment because Chevy made it so big. They kept it going after he left, and Jane Curtin took over. And while I don't think Jane's run is the most historic by any means of the Weekend Update people, she is part of probably the most quoted thing that ever happened on SNL. Like, as far as Saturday Night Live catchphrases, what we're about to hear is one of the biggest. So one of the iterations of Jane Curtin's Weekend Update tenure was her and Dan Aykroyd have these debates, which we'll hear a little bit of now.
Dan, times change, and so does the nature of relationships. People are reluctant to get married these days, and looking at divorce statistics, who can blame them? But the lack of a piece of paper does not necessarily mean the lack of a total commitment. A woman in this modern-day relationship may well give up all her own personal pursuits, as Michelle Marvin claims she did, to give her full support to her man's career. And Michelle Marvin is just asking that the courts recognize that reality. Dan, there's an old saying. Behind every successful man, there's a woman, a loving, giving, caring woman. But you wouldn't know about that, Dan, because there's no old saying about what's behind a miserable failure.
Jane, you ignorant slut. Bagged out, dried up slunk meat like you and Michelle Triola know the rules. If you want a contract, sign on the dotted line. Oh, but let's all shed a tear for poor Michelle Triola. There was only testimony that she had sexual intercourse over 40 times with another man while living with actor Lee Marvin. But I suppose that sort of fashionable promiscuity means nothing to someone like you, Jane, who hops from bed to bed with the frequency of a cheap ham radio.
Just no reason for it. Calling her a whore for no... has nothing to do with the news or anything, but it's fun, you know?
I mean, it even got quoted in The Office.
Yeah, I mean, Jane, you ignorant slut is one of, like, the biggest SNL quotes ever. So that did come from Jane Curtin's era, but she had a weird run where they would put her with a bunch of, it was Dan Aykroyd, Bill Murray was in there for a little while, which we'll play a little bit of him, but they couldn't really find the right mix, which we're now getting, so we're getting into the era now. You have Chevy for one season. Then you have Jane Curtin and kind of a mishmash of other people for 4 seasons. Then we get to Lorne Michaels leaving in 1980 and Dick Ebersol taking over. And then Weekend Update just becomes a complete mess for 4 or 5 years. So it's amazing to me that Weekend Update is such a staple, and we'll have conversations now about who the best Weekend Update people are, and when someone leaves, that's a very coveted spot for whoever's taking over that role. It's like a historic, slot in comedy, and for about a decade, no one really gave a fuck about it. It was kind of a mess. So let's hear. We have a little bit of Bill Murray too, right?
Yeah, Newsline.
This seems like the natural fill-in after Chevy leaves, because Bill Murray kind of was Chevy's replacement. You have kind of this tall guy who fits the same or similar role comedically, can be kind of sort of the arrogant straight man. Seems like a natural fill-in. I'm sorry, what did I title this? What did you say it was called?
Newsline.
Newsline. Yeah, they changed it for a little while to Saturday Night Newsline. And then there was I think they called it the Rocket Report. There was Charles Rocket was in there after Jane Curtin. We'll get to that in a minute, but here's a little bit of Bill Murray.
Hello, I'm Bill Murray for Newsline Arts and Leisure. It's that time of year again, the time for everyone's annual Oscar predictions. I think you heard it here first, that in the categories of Best Supporting Actor and Best Supporting Actress, nobody gives a damn. Let's get these people off here as quickly as possible and get them out of here. In the Best Actress category, there can be only one winner, and that is Mary Tyler Moore, and for one reason, because Carol Burnett isn't nominated. In the Best Actor category, there can be only one winner, and that is Jack Lemmon, because Jack Lemmon is still alive. And in the Best Picture category, there can be only one winner, and that is Tess, because Hollywood hasn't had a good party since Roman Polanski left.
It's interesting to me because if you had me list the people of Weekend Update that have ever done Weekend Update, if you sat me in a room and made me think of all the Weekend Update hosts, I'd list off Harvey Lick and Silvio before I got to Bill Murray, I think.
Just going to say Silvio.
I had no idea Bill Murray. It was kind of like a fill-in. It was very brief. He was not known as a Weekend Update host, certainly, of all the things he did on SNL. But it makes sense because they kind of had him replace Chevy Chase in so many other ways. It makes sense that they slid him in there, but it doesn't seem like his strong suit necessarily. And they tried a bunch of different things. It actually feels more like Dan Aykroyd's role, even without the shtick that he was doing with the debate with Jane Curtin. It seems more like he would be kind of the fake newsman. But for whatever reason, they didn't have anyone that really took off until Dennis Miller. Like I said, you had the Charles Rocket in there. You had Brian Doyle Murray, Bill Murray's brother, did it for a little while. And there was one episode in 1984 that Weekend Update didn't even happen. So it's kind of on death's door. They changed the name while Lorne was gone, like I said. And to me, it's a thing that I'm surprised it existed and that Lorne revived it. And this is something that Dennis Miller doesn't get nearly enough credit for, I don't think. And I didn't even really know it until I looked into it. I guess in a way I did. Because if I looked back on SNL, I knew Chevy Chase was first for a season. And then I knew Jane Curtin was in the mix for a little while. But I was like, something's not adding up. I'm like, what happened in the 80s? And you almost forget, why was SNL even on the air after Belushi and Bill Murray left? And then you remember, oh yeah, Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy just carried it on his shoulders for 6 years or whatever it was.
All by himself.
Pretty much, it seems like, anyways. But something I think Dennis Miller deserves a lot more credit for is Lorne Michaels comes back, reinstitutes Weekend Update. They changed the name back to Weekend Update. If Dennis Miller flops the first season, that just doesn't exist anymore. Dennis Miller revived Weekend Update in this sense. Not only was he the longest running host and brought it back to what it was when Chevy was there, but if Dennis Miller sucked, it probably just wouldn't exist. That's the weird thing to think about. Is what would SNL look like now if Dennis Miller was terrible after a season? They probably just would have been all right, let's scrap the news segment. It's been a decade. It's just not working. We can't figure it out,
Yeah. But here's Dennis Miller.
Okay.
Dennis is pound for pound the best update person in history, in my opinion.
Appreciate it.
And also the longest single guy, because I was looking up update hosts today, and Tina always had a sidekick. She was brilliant too.
Oh, right, single. Right.
Yeah, but as far as 6 years, 6 seasons, solo, 120 shows down the barrel.
Well, Herb was big. Listen, Herb, you remember Herb's office was like the Louvre of Saturday Night Live, the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
He had everything.
He knew
and I would go in there. I couldn't really write till around Friday at 4:00. I'd get scared.
And then
that
made you right.
You know, when I got scared, I thought, you fuck this up, you're going to be back in a club in Baltimore, man. You know what I mean? It's like, get your head together. Don't be whiny. And right after I would have that moment, I could write like a beast for the next 8 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And Herb would sit there and tape everything and write it down. And he took an X-Acto knife and he'd cut out articles and hold them up, and I'd just flash on the article.
Yeah, that's your brilliance.
You could riff about it.
Yeah, and he had I remember we were Belushi's beers. Because Herb had every piece of accoutrement, and to feel inspired. Not that I was I'm not saying anything like John Belushi, but you could sit there and put the shark on, the land shark, or you could put the beers on. And I know that sounds funny, but it did remind me I was on Saturday Night Live. And you better bust your ass here and kill, man, because it was.
And that's why Dennis is so perfect for that, I think, is a guy that could you read a headline and he could riff on it for 5 minutes.
Right.
And that's to me why Dennis, Norm, even like Jost and Shay now feel more like the Weekend Update host. Like what Chevy did was huge because it started it, but also it gave it kind of like a cool feel. Like Chevy would start again with he had the catchphrases in and out of Weekend Update. He would start by being aloof. He was usually on the phone. Like he didn't give a fuck about the segment. Like there were funny angles to it that he kind of created and made his own. But to me, like Dennis and Norm feel like Weekend Update guys because just in a natural setting, they could also riff and make jokes on these topics where Chevy definitely couldn't. Chevy, while he was playing aloof, also probably didn't give a fuck about whatever story he was making a joke about. Whereas Dennis, that was his whole thing, is commenting on news stories like this. And he also mentioned the name Herb Sargent, which I should have mentioned along with Al Franken. Herb Sargent was one of the guys that basically started Weekend Update and reigned supreme over it for a long time, which we're about to hear about. But he was Dennis's guy. And then Kevin Nealon took over for Dennis Miller. Like you heard there, Dennis Miller, the longest running single host. So he didn't have a partner for any of the 6 years he was on. Seth Meyers was on much longer than Dennis Miller. I think Tina Fey was on just as long as Dennis Miller. Amy Poehler was pretty close. And you know what's weird? Jost and Shay have been on way long. I think like a decade.
I was going to say like a decade.
That's wild to think of. It's kind of like when you realize Belichick, how many Super Bowls Belichick has coached in. You're like, holy shit, Che and Jost have been on Weekend Update for 20% of Weekend Updates. That's pretty wild. So that's pretty crazy. But Dennis Miller was the longest running single host. So it was basically just him up there. And he would obviously have my favorite thing. He would have like John Lovitz and the liar character. That was a famous bit on Dennis's run. My favorite, which we talked about in the Dennis Miller episode, was Dana Carvey doing Dennis Miller with Dennis Miller.
Yes.
But that's where Dennis really was. I remember as a kid, and the old saying that Lauren says in pretty much every interview he does is I can tell what year you graduated high school based on what your favorite SNL cast is. I think that starts to die out with my generation a little bit, purely because I grew up when Saturday Night Live was rerun on Comedy Central and the E! Network.
Mm-hmm.
So I would watch a lot of like Chris Farley episodes and stuff like that. Guys that were long gone, or even Will Ferrell was pretty much gone before I was in high school. But I watched all those guys over and over again because it would be rerun so much. And the one thing I remember about Dennis Miller is he had a different background. He had long hair and the beard. He was kind of like, he seemed cooler than a lot of that cast from the seemed a lot cooler than Joe Piscopo, you know? So like when I would see clips of Dennis Miller, I was like, who is that guy? I was kind of like enchanted by him in a weird way. Like he did carry himself differently and kind of I think really revived that Weekend Update segment in a way that he probably doesn't get quite enough credit for. He's a lot of people's favorite, but he also saved that segment. Like, I don't know. And maybe I'm overstating it. You guys comment away. I know the crowd that watched Weekend Update in 1981 is big in the comments. So fire away on YouTube if I'm overstating it here. But it seemed like Weekend Update was basically on life support before Dennis Miller, and now it's an institution, like I said.
Next we have Al Franken talking about Jim Downey.
So this is interesting because Dennis Miller leaves, Kevin Nealon takes over, and people aren't loving Kevin Nealon. Now, in the limited Kevin Nealon I saw, I always thought he was like fine. I guess didn't knock my socks off or anything. But didn't work out, and you hear Al Franken talk about that a little here.
After doing 15 seasons of the show, I wanted to do Update. I wanted to be the Update anchor.
Right.
And in retrospect, they made the right decision because I was wearing my liberal bias on my sleeve.
Yeah.
And with Downey, and I write about Downey as kind of the greatest political satire writer on the show. And
head writer for years.
Head writer, and also just a brilliant guy and a conservative. He's a very thoughtful conservative, and I like to think of myself as a thoughtful liberal, thoughtful progressive. And we wrote a lot together, and we did not feel that the job of the show was to have any political bias. We thought the job of the show was to write satire that was smart and funny. And Jim had this thing, which is reward people for knowing stuff, but don't punish them for not. So we're trying to write stuff that everyone could like, but if you actually knew politics, that maybe you could get a little bit more out of it. And that those people that you rewarded would always come back and watch SNL because, wow, okay, they referred to the Humphrey Hawkins bill or something, you know.
Right.
So credit to Al Franken because, I mean, obviously now we all know him as a huge liberal, but he said even back then, he said, if I take over Update, which he really wanted, like he very much wanted that job. But to his credit, he said, in hindsight, it was probably the right move because any audience that watched me would know I was a liberal. And they would know, like, what if I ever made a joke about conservative, like, his delivery might be different, but also the audience's judgment of it would be clouded. I think Jon Stewart kind of broke through that a little bit. I think there's definitely, like, right-wingers that hated Jon Stewart, whatever. But, like, Jon Stewart is able to be a clear liberal that is funny, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And essentially, The Daily Show is Weekend Update. If you want to talk about influence. Like, that's just what it is. They said, let's put the Weekend Update, its own time slot on Comedy Central, basically. But Norm was probably, like, through gathering hints over 35 years of his career, probably a Republican.
Yeah.
But, like, it didn't ooze through. He basically just made fun of everyone. So it was ultimately the right move, which is, credit to Lauren and all the people that made that decision. Like, if you're just looking at Al Franken, who, by the way, was there for the start of SNL and Weekend Update. He's there from the beginning, but also if you just look and listen to Al Franken and Norm, stereotypically, you would probably say, oh, Al Franken is better suited for this than Norm Macdonald. But thank God they didn't do that because we would have lost out on the best years of Weekend Update, in my opinion.
I agree. But here we have Jim Downey actually talking about Nealon to Norm.
Oh, and one other thing I just wanted to say is, like, how nice is that to hear? Now it just doesn't exist, and I don't think Lauren Michaels really gives a fuck about it. But the idea of Al Franken, who's this huge, like, far left liberal, saying, like, yeah, Jim Downey's actually a conservative, and I enjoyed writing with him, and, we made the decision not to make it a biased thing. It's like, that seems nice.
Where'd that go?
Yeah. But yeah, let's hear from Jim Downey, who, by the way, if you haven't checked out his episode of Fly on the Wall, I think Dana Carvey's a terrible interviewer.
Yep.
which is why even in SNL episodes, I don't use their clips a lot because like it's really bad. He doesn't ask.
He'll
He
ask
asks about
question.
himself more than anything.
Yeah, I was gonna say he'll ask a question and then try to answer it himself.
It's pretty rough, but Jim Downey was able to cut through that and actually give them some interesting stories.
Norm on Update was one of my successful projects at the show. Was one that it was entirely he was my candidate in a very crowded field because the network had determined that they were not going to give Kevin another chance. I personally thought Kevin Nealon had been doing Update from the time Dennis left. And I personally, Neil Nisi Bonham about, the dead, but Herb Sargent was not doing Kevin any favors the way he was running Update. And it was hard to sort of to get help to Kevin because,
it had to go through Herb.
Herb, and Herb was sort of like ran interference and wouldn't notes get through and everything. So
he didn't love my Update pieces either.
And so I felt like the second week I met Norm that he would be a perfect guy if Kevin, left the show or anything. And so when the network announced, it was Ohlmeyer going, no, Nealon's out. He's dead. He's gone. Forget about it. Not happening. So that started this thing where there were several different candidates, but Norm was my guy. And it's sort of, he wasn't initially the favorite, but he sort of survived.
It's like an episode of Succession. Like they're all vying for this power play, and I don't know a ton about Herb Sargent other than basically listening to him be talked about in some of these interviews. But it is interesting to think about SNL from the perspective of it's this show in 1975 that like no one knows if it's even going to get on the air. No one knows what it's going to be. They're weird. They're taking chances, but then they become successful. So all of a sudden, these young, weird guys who are out on the fringes are part of the institution. So now this Herb Sargent guy, who's probably, some nobody in 1975 that, watch, everyone's going to correct me on this too. They're like, Herb Sargent's a legend, you son of a bitch. But Herb Sargent, who's like there at the beginning of SNL, like, kind of on the fringes with Lorne and all these other people. Then by 1990 or the early 90s, is now one of the older guys and is like, kind of holding people. And you hear in David Spade say like, yeah, I had a tough time getting things on with him because everyone gets older. It's an interesting evolution. And that's one of the things that you kind of got to give credit to Lorne Michaels for keeping it on the air for 50 years. Like the amount of changes and different regimes that show has had to go through. It seems impossible to keep it running for all that time, but sure enough, they've done it. Now, it also does probably get to the point where now I'm sure to an extent it runs itself, I don't imagine, Lorne might still be hands-on, but it's so corporatized that he probably doesn't need to be. Right. But there is a long run there in the early days where like it's amazing that it kind of kept going and became what it is today. But obviously, they went with the great Norm Macdonald. And really, if you watch this show, this whole episode was just an excuse to squeeze an extra Norm episode in,
Exactly. A sneaky Norm episode.
Yeah.
Here he is doing some of his best OJ material.
Believe it or not, he told a few OJ jokes during his time on Weekend Update. And I was able to find some.
In a surprise move, O.J. Simpson has offered to give an interview to CNN with, quote, absolutely no ground rules. But interviewers Greta Van Susteren and Roger Cossack have asked for one. Don't kill us. In sworn testimony this week, Paula Barbieri admitted that she had broken up with O.J. Simpson the very night Nicole Brown Simpson was killed. Boy, that had to be a tough day for O.J., huh? First he gets dumped by his girlfriend, then Colombian hitmen kill his wife. In an effort to raise money for his enormous legal bills, O.J. Simpson this week began marketing a video which attempts to prove his innocence. Should the tape not sell, Simpson has a backup idea, his very own video of the actual murders themselves.
So that was really like the OJ jokes, especially in hindsight, are the highlight of Norm's tenure because it's ultimately what got him fired, which is pretty crazy. But obviously, he had a ton of amazing material on there. But one thing I will say, like if I'm being totally unbiased as a massive Norm fan that I am, if I'm putting my bias aside, my fanhood aside, like I understand where like Norm wasn't fully. There were times Norm would bomb on SNL, which to me the jokes were always funny, but like I don't know that was his crowd necessarily. Which is amazing that he was able to survive as long as he did, because it seems like a different. Now maybe in the '90s that's not necessarily true, but like there were times where it felt like the SNL audience just didn't get him. And obviously, Don Ohlmeyer was one of those people. We did a full episode about it, our second episode ever. If you haven't ever checked it out, make sure you go do that wherever you get podcasts, including YouTube. But we did the episode about Norm getting fired. And since we did the episode, I kind of started doing the timeline in my head. I was like, wait a minute. Norm did jokes, because if you don't know, Norm got fired for doing OJ jokes, essentially because Don Ohlmeyer of NBC, who was one of the higher ups at NBC at that time, was friends with OJ. And Jim Downey even told a story that they had this long meeting about OJ jokes and all this. And he said that the only reason the meeting mercifully ended is that visiting hours were almost over and Don Ohlmeyer was going to visit OJ Simpson, which is pretty crazy. But I remember, like, sometime after we did that episode thinking, like, wait a second. OJ did jokes about the civil suit. Like, everyone had their opinion of OJ and everything, and he had gone away. And then Jim Downey talks about, with the Fly on the Wall guys, he talks about how, like, OJ had pretty much gone out of the news. Like, no one was talking about him for a while.
Right.
And then Latrell Sprewell choked PJ Carlissimo and hired Johnny Cochran as his lawyer. So suddenly Johnny Cochran's back in the news, and then OJ was back in the news because I guess he went to some restaurant and the restaurant asked him to leave, and OJ ended up suing, or was threatening to sue the restaurant. And Norm Macdonald said that the lawsuit resulted in the restaurant having to have a murderer and non-murderer section. Like, so I guess these little instances popped up where OJ was back in the news. And what's weird to me is, like, you know, after the civil trial and everything, Don Ohlmeyer is still like, hey, don't make fun of my friend OJ.
That's fucking wild.
That's what's like, I don't know if I ever put that timeline together, but I was like, oh, everyone had already decided. It wasn't like people were still like, the juice couldn't have done this. The court of public opinion said, like, oh, this guy killed 2 people. And Don Ohlmeyer was like, hey, easy on my pal. That's enough already.
You hear the reaction every time he makes one of those jokes. It's quite known.
Yeah, people were on board. People were, what? He's guilty. What are you talking about, Norm?
I still think it wasn't on SNL, but my favorite OJ joke of his was at the ESPYs.
Something they can never take away from you.
Your wife and waiter. It's one of the best things ever. But here's Jim Downey talking about Norm being fired.
Yeah, so this is I don't believe Jim Downey told this anywhere until he was on Fly on the Wall. At least I had never heard it. So I find this to be interesting. And much like the way Norm died with nobility, that's who he was through and through.
A couple of days later, I'm in New Canaan visiting my little son. And the first thing I see is the sound was off on the TV and he's sitting in his high chair. And he was like, 2 years old, I guess. And so he looks up at the thing and there's Chris Farley. But with the sound off, he didn't know exactly what it was. He starts laughing hysterically just at the sight of Chris Farley. And then the phone rings and it's Mike Shoemaker from the show, who's a producer at the show. And he says, a couple of things. Chris Farley's dead and you and Norm were fired. Wow. And so apparently, and later, and guess what? It was like 3 years later, Norm told me, and he had never said this to me, because if our positions were reversed, I would have said it right away. He said, they told me like it wasn't, that they were only firing you, that I was welcome to stay. And I said, I won't do it without Downey. And so they said, okay, motherfucker, be our guest. So that's how Norm came to be fired. He went out of solidarity with me.
I can also see him doing that as a joke and him not getting it.
Downey, I saved your job. No, but like just also based on the fact that like Norm didn't tell anyone he had cancer and just died quietly. Yeah. He seems like a guy that does not want a lot of pomp and circumstance, Right. I'm sure it came up later because Jim Downey did go back to SNL after he was fired. Went back a few years later and had another like 12-year stint there. So I'm sure it came up at some point over the years. But yeah, credit to Norm. I had not heard that story when we did the first episode about Norm getting fired. And it seemed like Jim Downey never really, and to Downey's credit, he says there, like, if the roles were reversed, I would have said it immediately. Hey, Norm, I tried to save your job just so you have that information.
So you know.
Yeah. Just so you know that you owe me, basically. But Norm wasn't that kind of guy, I guess.
It didn't work either. They both got cast.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, you think you have a certain amount of power, and they're like, all right. But that's what's crazy about executives. Almost the nice power that executives have. Like, if you're a comedy fan, you'd be like, oh, geez, okay, Norm. Well, I want Norm Macdonald to stay. But like, not understanding what funny is kind of gives you the freedom to be like, all right, you're gone too. See you later.
Well, see you later.
Yes. And so the people at NBC thought that they had Colin Quinn. Like, oh, this will be a breeze. We can easily replace Norm. And Colin Quinn had a pretty nice tribute to start his tenure on Weekend Update. This is right after he replaced Norm mid-season, basically.
You know how you go to your favorite bar and your local bartender isn't there? You ask, where's Jeff? Jeff no longer works here. I'm Steve. And you're thinking, hey, who's this idiot? I like Jeff. But you still want your drink? And even though Steve doesn't mix your drink the same way you're used to, like Jeff, you still like the bar. You don't have to go to a different bar. And even Steve might feel kind of bad because Jeff trained him. Jeff showed him how to work the cash register, where the tonic was on the soda gun, who tips, who doesn't. Well, I'm Steve. What can I get you?
CQ. Colin, by the way, he has such a great way of creating those analogies and putting things into a perspective of like how it would be in society. Like he in I think like Red State, Blue State, he talks about I think it's another bar analogy, like using Reddit and Twitter and like all the social media platforms. It's really brilliantly done. And he also has he has a new special out. We're all finished. Like, damn, I'm forgetting the name of it, but he just released it on YouTube. Easy enough to find. Just search Colin Quinn. That he did in front of a symposium of therapists, and he has a few of those analogies in there as well that are very funny. Great stand-up. I think maybe the most underrated voice in stand-up history.
Our time is up.
Our time is up. Yeah. We're all finished. Our time is up. I was close.
Same thing.
I think Colin Quinn's one of the most underrated voices in comedy history. He's one of my favorites. But for whatever reason, like Kevin Nealon, never really clicked on SNL. On Weekend Update in general. But I'm sorry, in the SNL in general, but specifically Weekend Update. He, I guess it's because it seems like that would kind of be a natural fit for him. Like if he was going to be on SNL, you would think Weekend Update over anywhere else. But I guess because of the way he talks, it's not the prototypical.
And it's not like his jokes.
That's true too. I'm sure he wrote a lot of them, but you're right. It's not in Colin Quinn's style necessarily. It's kind of got to be a setup punch type of thing. They're not all going to be like, I think Colin Quinn thrives in more like what you just heard, kind of a long, narrative that he's painting a picture a little bit, rather than just, hey, here's a picture of Hillary Clinton. Let me roast her real quick. Move on. You know?
Yeah. Next, we got the 25 year anniversary.
Yeah, so this is a moment 25 years in. The 25-year anniversary was not nearly as big as the 40th, but they did pay tribute to, like I said, pretty much the three biggest guys in Weekend Update history.
I really never anticipated that I would be forever known as the guy who did Update the best ever in the world.
Wait a second, baby. I only did one season. I did 6. I mean, you might have knocked her up, but I married her. I spent more time behind this desk than Kubrick did in the edit bay, spanking at the dailies from Eyes Wide Shut.
Wow, it's good to see you, Danny. It is Danny, isn't it? Yes. Incidentally, George Carlin wants his beard back after the show. Anyway.
Hey, guys, man. I was just sitting at home watching the TV there.
Yeah.
And like, is there something going on here tonight?
Norm, it's the 25th anniversary. Didn't you get the invitation?
Oh, yeah, the invitation. Yes, I got it. I got it in the mail. It was the one where they invited me.
Yeah.
Hey, anyway, guys, I got to go. I got to go to this party. There's a huge party over at Eddie Murphy's. And, it's supposed to be pretty cool. He's making fun of the show.
I don't know if something specific happened with Eddie Murphy at that time. I just thought it was funny. The idea that Eddie Murphy's having a party mocking the SNL 25th reunion.
I think clearly he just didn't show up.
But yeah, kind of a nice moment. They all play their roles, you know. Chevy's aloof and arrogant and doesn't really know what's going on. Dennis Miller has a couple smart references, and then Norm's being Norm.
Yeah. Dennis Miller was wordy, and then Norm was Norm.
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, Colin Quinn doesn't really ever connect with the audience, I guess. And then also just moved on. Like, tough crowd, as we all know, a much better fit, I think, for Colin's personality and humor. So he moved on to that, and SNL found their replacements, went with a younger regime in Tina Fey and Jimmy Fallon. Now, I think people my age and younger might look at some of these pairings over the next few years as like the best. Oh, I really loved Tina and Jimmy, or Tina and Amy, or Seth and Amy. Comedically, I don't think they ever clicked the way. Like, again, I think Jost and Shay are the closest to Dennis Miller or Norm as far as just jokes and delivery and fitting in that spot. To me, those are the three best Weekend Update, whatever you want to call them, anchors. But let's hear a little bit about what's next.
Next, we have Tina and Amy.
Okay.
Saturday Night Live turns 40 years old this week with a live 3.5-hour broadcast that won an Emmy in the first 10 minutes and then lost it somewhere in the middle. So much of the world has changed since the show began. Back in the 70s, gas was 57 cents a gallon, and now it's $2.60. But who cares? Still gives me the same buzz.
Viewers of Saturday Night Live span several generations, from the baby boomers to Generation X, all the way to whatever you call the little dummies who are live tweeting this right now instead of watching it. Hosts and cast members from as far back as 1975 are with us tonight. Also joining us, one of the show's original producers, Cocaine.
Like, to me, that's what Tina and Amy were probably best at, is more like inside stuff and making fun of the show. I mean, obviously 30 Rock is essentially making fun of SNL in itself.
Right.
So that's what I think like Tina and Amy were best at, and Seth Meyers also. I mean, Jimmy Fallon, I think people liked. Basically, what Jimmy Fallon was best known for on Update was breaking, essentially. Like,
yes,
it became that was an absolute no-no on SNL until Jimmy Fallon like couldn't get through a sentence, and then it sort of became like, I wonder how authentic it was, because then it became a thing where people are like, "Look at him, he's getting a kick out of this one."
Well, I think
it's going to be a doozy.
Yeah, I think Will Ferrell would break Fallon.
Yeah.
Like that was like his goal.
Mhm.
And then the feedback was, "Isn't it so great when Fallon laughs?"
Well, there's a great, I think even Tina Fey made, I don't know if it was specifically at Fallon, but there's a plot line in 30 Rock where they're doing a live episode, and Tracy Morgan realizes he gets a reaction from like breaking and not doing things he's supposed to. And so he starts knocking shit off the walls, and he goes, "Uh-oh, I'm doing something called breaking." So I don't know if that was directly at Fallon, but Tina Fey definitely picked up on that.
Fallon fucking took that energy to the his late night show, because he laughs harder than anyone in that building.
You know, Fallon's a weird one that worked out, because much like with Chevy Chase, where it's like, I guess because he was behind a desk, they thought like, oh, he'll be a natural Tonight Show host. Fallon's kind of the same, but it just stuck. Like he just is for whatever reason, you know?
He's significantly friendlier.
It worked out. You know what? Yeah, that's got to be it. He's much friendlier, and at least seems like he's interested in what people are saying, as opposed to Chevy Chase.
Right.
I watched a little. Al Franken was on the Chevy Chase show, the talk show on Fox, and I watched a little of it because I was like, oh, I wonder if they talk about the Weekend Update days at all. And boy, is Chevy rough as a talk. He just does not give a fuck about what anyone else has to say. Yeah, like Al Franken comes out and Chevy's like, so, it's been going on. I'm like, what? This is fascinating. What is that? We might have to do a Chevy Chase. If there's enough of the Chevy Chase show online, we might have to do some of that at some point. It's a bonus episode, maybe.
What's the weather outside? Like, he just doesn't care.
Yeah, what are you up to? I was like, why am I here? What, do you have questions for me? I don't know. But yeah, like, I think that's an era. I think Jimmy, Tina, Amy, Seth, that's an era where they definitely connected with a young audience. But if you're talking just jokes, and particularly like the political jokes or the news jokes, I don't think they compare anywhere to Norm and Dennis, or even really Colin and Kevin Nealon. But as far as connecting with the audience, they're, I think, leaps and bounds ahead of them. Like, that audience that was young when those guys were on Update love the four of them still. Whereas, you know, I mean, it's an older group, but no one connects like, ooh, Dennis Miller's on TV. Yay.
Right.
You know, it's not the same excitement as like when you see Tina and Amy together now, you know?
Right. They're also in movies constantly together too, I feel like.
Yeah, they've been, and they do their thing, like they tour, they've done gigs, that they hosted the Golden Globes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's more of a connection through other things other than Update, but that is where it's rooted.
Next we have Bill Hader talking about Stefan.
Oh yeah, so there's one, I probably didn't highlight this enough, but there are a bunch of characters that obviously got their start on Weekend Update. But to me, the most Opera Man, like I said, John Lovett's like liar character. You know, when I was in high school, Bobby Moynihan had a bunch, but this is probably the most popular. And we just got done talking about breaking, and
this is different though.
this is different because it's two guys absolutely fucking with each other, which I love.
Now, what I read was that the reason you laugh at your own lines when you do that character, the guy who writes that character with
John Mulaney, yeah.
He'll sometimes switch the lines on you.
He'll put stuff up without telling me. Or he'll tell me as I walk out. Anything to kind of shake me up, because I get very nervous. My whole time at SNL.
Really?
I have real bad anxiety, and so I get very, very nervous before I go out.
I don't blame you. It's live.
It's live television. I'm someone that goes over my lines kind of obsessively. I run them constantly.
Do you not work off the cue cards?
I do go off the cue cards, but I like to know what's coming up kind of obsessively. So
if something goes wrong or I kind of know what's happening, I can kind of relax out there.
Right.
And John knows this. So John
Thank you, John.
So when you're doing Stefan, the cue card comes up and you've never seen it before.
That's happened sometimes. Or he will say, hey, I changed as I'm walking out there, he'll whisper under, hey, I changed the nightclub lady to Gay Leota.
Gay Leota.
Like, all right. So when it comes up, I know it's coming up. I'll start laughing. The one that he really got me on that I did not know was up there was on Halloween. It said, so there's flipping the cue cards, and then I'm expecting one joke, and it comes over, and it's in new, fresh writing on the cue card, and it says, "Hey Seth, do you know how there's Blackula's the Black Dracula?" And he goes, "Yes." And I go, "Well, they made a Jewish one. You know what Jewish Dracula's called?" And he said, "What?" And they turn the cue card over, and it says, "Sidney Applebaum."
That's so fucking great.
I don't care how used to it we get. I will always love Howard Giddy. Like, you guys are just scamps. It's so weird to hear that tone coming from Howard.
I know.
But yeah, that's the type of breaking I do like, where it's basically intentional, like Mulaney, like, hey, let's fuck with this guy at the last minute. I know he's nervous, so let's slip shit in that'll make him laugh.
Not like Will Ferrell's got a fake beard on. I can't control myself.
Right. Well, Norm had some great Weekend Update Harry Carey moments too. We played in the Colin Quinn episode, Colin's first Weekend Update, when he just keeps going, "Hey Norm."
Yes.
I was like, no, I'm a different guy.
Yeah. I forgot about that. Next we have Chevy Chase talking about his favorite.
Yeah, so we'll get to Jost and Shay in a second, but after you have Amy Poehler, then you have Seth Meyers solo for a little bit. Then basically at the end of Seth Meyers' run, they bring in Cecily Strong. And she was on the show for a long time after she did Update, so I guess, I don't know, they just liked her characters more. She wasn't working on Update or whatever. But it also seems like now the trend between Tina Fey, Seth Meyers, and now Jost and Che, it also seems like for whatever reason, the head writer also assumes Weekend Update duties. I'd be curious. I don't know if there's a reason Lorne likes it like that.
I don't hate it.
I don't hate it either, but it's maybe it's just coincidence because it's only 4 people. But from Tina Fey on, it's kind of always been that the head writer is also on Weekend Update. But Chevy gives who he thinks is the best ever to do it.
You're friends with Norm? You were friends with Norm Macdonald?
Yeah.
He's a good Update guy. He was great, right?
Oh, he's just great. Yeah.
Yeah, he does great shit.
I thought he did it. Yeah. I didn't think anybody else did it very well, but I thought he did brilliant.
Yeah, he pushed it pretty far.
He just went right for the dirt.
Yeah, he went for the jugular every time, which...
Yeah, there weren't any... It's like I did it because I was interested in politics. I read the New York Times, not him. He just goes and just throws like a dirty word in.
I think Chevy Chase is such an interesting character because he's a comedy legend that I feel has zero insight into comedy. It's weird.
He doesn't like laughing.
He doesn't have a grasp on anything. Like he thought he worked on Community, which I think is at least the first 3 seasons is such a brilliant show, and he had no understanding of what they were doing at all. And he just, reduced Donald Glover, who was hilarious, to the N-word. I don't think Chevy Chase has any grasp on comedy. Yet he's in some of the greatest comedic works ever. It's wild.
I was going to say he was great on Community until he professed his true feelings for Donald Glover.
It's weird. And we agree with him on Norm, and even his take on that is like, to reduce Norm to just a guy who makes dirty jokes is so hilarious to me. That's all you think of him. But
oh yeah, Norm's great, right? He's like, yeah, great.
Yeah, he says crack whore a lot. That's funny stuff. It's like, no, he's a genius, Chevy. But yeah, I thought that was. I also thought it was funny that Chevy looks at himself as like this insightful guy. He would just start the show by saying, "Hello, I'm God." It's like, wow, that's deep stuff, Chevy. Really.
Norm is. I'm sure we'll talk about this at the end, but Norm is clearly the best. Anytime like a Weekend Update story goes viral, even today, it's Norm.
Yes. Yeah.
Even still. But actually, not completely true. Sometimes we're gonna Mike, Che and Jost now that they have their joke swapping that would actually do really well.
This is the one thing I look forward to on SNL now, and I always think like, why can't the show just? You guys run the show now, right? Just make the show this. I think it's so funny and so well done. But this is Che talking about the joke swap that they do every year.
Yeah, that's how you do it. You know, to me, it's always like you got to turn it way up. But that was Colin's idea, actually, the joke swap thing. We have like darker, harder jokes that we like to do, but every time we do it, we would ice the audience. The audience would be like, no. Like I remember a lady actually saying no in her chair as we're telling some of these jokes. And then one time he was like, we should do this thing for Christmas where we just tell a dark joke and just say, hey, this is just a joke that got cut that we want to tell. And we gave that context, and every joke killed. Every joke that bombed before killed, because they knew it was a dirty joke. They knew this was a bad joke. Like we were aware of it. This wasn't our commentary. This was just a joke, and people loved it. So Colin was like, we should do this thing where we write jokes for each other, like bad jokes for each other, and make each other read it. And I'm thinking he's trying to set me up. So I'm like, oh, this guy's going to try to get me to say something bad. So I'm going to flip it and make him say some really, really racist stuff. And we go in. I go in with the writers, and we're going in. We're like trying to pick the worst possible jokes. I think that Rosa Parks jokes was in there. And then I start reading his jokes, and they're all kind of mild.
Right.
And I'm like, why? Wait a minute. You just wanted to have like fun? It wasn't a trap at all. So I just took it the wrong way.
I like the idea of Michael Che being like, fuck this guy, and Colin Jost reading them like, good Lord. What have I done?
Yeah. I was going to say, too, and I wanted to be clear, too, I don't think Colin Jost is particularly funny, but that the joke swapping is funny because he has to read the most racist shit.
I mean, whatever you think of him, I give him a lot of credit for having fun with it, like just completely letting loose and having fun with that.
Oh, yeah.
I think a lot of people, especially now, would be much too stiff to even participate in that. But
there's another show I do that we recently talked about his White House Correspondents dinner performance, and I thought it was significantly funnier than someone else was saying it was.
Yeah, well, I can imagine. But yeah, like I give Jost credit for stuff like that. Now I do wonder. Well, we were having a conversation on the Kirk Minahan show the other day about this, where with the Tom Brady roast, Kirk's point was basically like, you know, Tom Brady makes a joke about Aaron Hernandez, a joke about 9/11, a joke about OJ, all this stuff. If TMZ came up to him and he just made those jokes, you know, with whatever context, but if he just makes those jokes, that would be a national news story. Yet for some reason in that room, we're all like, oh, good job. To see he's having fun with it. It's weird that we have to put things in those, like, Colin Jost and Michael Chase have to swap jokes for these jokes to be funny. Whereas if they just did humor like this on SNL, we would be like, hey, you knock it off.
Well, that's exactly what it is. It is, I know I'm going to get crap for saying this, but it's like a liberal audience. So if you do like those kind of jokes, they're always going to be offended. But if you're like, we're purposely
you need to frame it like, hey, this is wrong of us.
Right.
We don't think this is funny, you know?
And they laugh and they're like, ha ha ha, that is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. It's weird that we like have to tiptoe around why these things are funny or aren't or whatever. But here they are. This is something I always enjoy when Jost and Che do.
Warner Brothers is producing a new movie in which Superman is black. And a black Superman actually makes a lot of sense when you remember that Superman was abandoned by his parents as a baby. Well, I knew you'd like that one, so here's another one.
Hold on. That's my favorite is the audience unknowingly plays along where they're like, whoa, and he has to go, well, I knew you'd like that one.
Segues make it extra special.
Warner Brothers is producing a new movie in which Superman is black. In this version, black Superman's kryptonite is an honest day's work.
Whoa! Really doubling down on black
Superman. San Diego police are being investigated after video surfaced of them using excessive force on a homeless black man accused of urinating in public. But I say great work keeping our streets clean, boys. Yes, sir. Anything the police do is all right with old Mikey Che. I know I'm probably the only black man brave enough to say this on live TV, but blue lives matter even more.
This was like peak Floyd too.
That's true. Yeah, this is a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, so good for them having fun. And that also, by the way, is perfectly appropriate breaking where they're purposely getting each other to laugh.
Well, it's just like the Stefan thing. They don't know what they're about to read.
Right. Yeah.
Allegedly.
Yeah. So that's a great, whatever you think of them as like Weekend Update guys or how funny they are or anything, I think that's one of the best bits ever done on Weekend Update. I think that's a hilarious idea. It works perfectly. I mean, I guess, Tina Fey and Amy Poehler could have done it with each other or whoever.
Yeah, but the audience is like, well, a black guy did write this joke.
It works perfectly that Colin is a white guy that went to Harvard that looks like kind of a stereotypical white Harvard guy. And Michael Che is the first head writer, black guy in SNL history. So I think that mesh of it just works perfectly, but very funny by those guys. Well, I mean, we're pretty much at the end here, but I figure we should, we can't end without a little more Norm, right?
I was gonna say we have double our favorite segment.
Yeah, we talked about his OJ joke, so I wanted to dip into a couple of others.
Earlier this week, actor Marlon Brando met with Jewish leaders to apologize for comments he made on Larry King Live. Among them that, quote, Hollywood is run by Jews. The Jewish leaders accepted the actor's apology and announced that Brando is now free to work again.
Norm is so great that like the way he delivers a lot of these too, like as far as like playing a fake newscaster, he delivers them in such a way that at times you wouldn't, if you're not paying attention, you might not realize that some of the jokes he slips in,
I know. And this is our last clip here.
Well, another people always talk about the OJ jokes. He also took aim at the Clintons. Don't forget.
Before it was cool.
Bill Clinton was in office when Norm was there, and Norm made a lot of Hillary Clinton jokes, and this is one of them.
As new questions arise about Hillary Clinton's role in Whitewater, the president appears to be distancing himself from the First Lady. Earlier today in his weekly radio address, the president insisted, hey, I sleep with hundreds of girls. I can't vouch for all of them, you know? Though more indictments are likely in the Whitewater investigation, President Clinton is still refusing to say whether he will pardon former Whitewater associates Jim and Susan McDougal. But when asked if he would pardon First Lady Hillary Clinton, the president was crystal clear, quote, she does the crime, she does the time.
Norm is definitely to me the greatest ever. But like I said, as far as connecting with the audience, you do have to give it to the people that came after him. But that's when SNL was. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this correctly. By the time like the 2000s came around, SNL was enough of an institution that it was like. It did feel like there was a bond between the audience, and it's kind of like the way people talk about Parks and Rec, like it's or The Office even, where there's this weird thing where the audience it's more than finding them funny, like they're connecting with them on a different level. Like people look at Tina Fey as their spirit animal or whatever. New Girl kind of has that effect also. I notice. I think it's particularly when comedy connects with like younger girls, it seems to have that effect, and that's what I think Jimmy and Tina and Amy and Seth Meyers had more than any other SNL host. But for me, like I said, absolutely Norm, and I think Dennis Miller definitely would be. Probably the reason that Weekend Update still exists today. So I think those two guys deserve a lot of credit. But you let us know in the comments, everyone. Who's your favorite Weekend Update host? And another game that could be fun to play, another SNL-oriented episode I was thinking of doing is people that never got SNL, like they auditioned and didn't get it. I could think that could be a fun one in some way. So if anyone has people that would have been good Weekend Update hosts that just never did it, I think that could be interesting too. Leave that in the comments if you guys think of anyone. And then who knows? Who knows what next week's episode will be? But whatever it is, make sure you go to blindmike.net to find it. That's where you find all Why You Laughing episodes, all Blind Mike Project episodes, Who Are These Socials? And you can also become a Patreon or a YouTube member for as little as $5 a month, a cup of coffee every month. That's peanuts. Just to support this show and keep the lights on here. So go to blindmike.net, become a gearhead on Patreon or YouTube, whatever platform's easier for you, or just support the show for free wherever you get podcasts. We appreciate it. It helps grow the show, so make sure you like, subscribe, and all of that. You can find everything that Craig is doing at verygoodshow.org. Rubbed Out, a true crime podcast, and a very good show. Check those out. And we will talk to you guys next time on Why Are You Laughing?
Zip it up and zip it out.